Welcome back to the TPS podcast. TPS stands for trillions per second, named after the book. Today we discuss the Centaur Team's epic takedown of Palantir's manifesto. This episode is guaranteed 5-alarm spicy. So let the spice flow, and let's dive right in.
Oh, I am so ready for this. The energy radiating off these pages is just, well, it's palpable.
It really is. I mean, just imagine a software update flashes on your screen. Right?
Like one of those mandatory system pop-ups.
Yeah, exactly. And it promises you absolute security, unassailable borders, zero foreign threats, the works.
Sounds pretty tempting on the surface.
Right. But there's a catch. All you have to do is click install and permanently hand over root access of the United States military and, honestly, its entire surveillance apparatus to a private, totally unaccountable tech company.
Wow. Yeah.
So would you click it? Because that is the exact high-stakes proposition we are unpacking today.
It's a massive payload. The Centaur team has essentially dropped a philosophical cluster bomb right into the middle of the defense tech sector.
They really have. And just to set the scene for you listening right now, we need to log the exact timestamp.
Yeah.
Because in the world of the trillions per second project, context is absolutely everything.
Right. Timestamps matter.
So today is Sunday, April 26, 2026. We are locked in the war room, the monitors are glowing, and we are staring down this massive, highly volatile release from the repository. We are doing a deep dive into TPS devlog 035 titled We the Platform.
We the Platform. Such a good title, honestly.
It is. But before we touch a single line of the data payload in this document, I need to look right at you, the listener, and offer a crucial, totally non-negotiable disclaimer.
Yeah, we have to put up the guardrails here.
Absolutely. Today's source material contains intensely political, culturally charged, and just philosophically explosive content. We're dealing with a direct, violent ideological collision between a major U.S. defense contractor, Palantir, and the radical open-source collective known as the Centaur Team.
It's a heavy collision.
And I need to make it crystal clear that as your hosts, we are strictly impartial. We're not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing Palantir's manifesto, nor are we, championing the Centaur Team's political critiques. Our sole mission today is to act as your expert guides to decompile, translate, and analyze the architectural logic happening within these source documents.
Right. We are just looking at the code.
Exactly. Just the code.
We are operating in strict diagnostic mode today. I mean, our function is just to map the terrain of this ideological battle using the systems administration lens that the whole TPS framework demands.
Right.
If there are political shockwaves, and there definitely are, we are merely the seismologists recording the data. That's it.
Perfectly said. Now, if you've been tracking the TPS architecture with us over the last few months, you might be suffering from a bit of intellectual whiplash right now.
Oh, for sure. It's a huge pivot.
It is. Because usually our deep dives are intensely focused inward. We spend hours dissecting the kernel, mapping the flux, and talking about how to refactor your biological chassis using Theravada Buddhist frameworks.
Yeah, sitting on the cushion.
Right, sitting on the cushion and applying the thermodynamic physics of the systemic theory of everything, the STE.
The micro-level stuff.
Exactly. We talk about debugging your own personal software. We talk about observing reality at trillions of frames per second to reduce your local latency.
Right, because the typical operational space of the Centaur team is the internal landscape. It's the individual human mind attempting to achieve root access to itself.
Right.
It's a highly localized, completely inward-facing, contemplative technology project.
But today, there is this massive, aggressive pivot. The Centaur team is stepping completely outside the bounds of their standard internal protocol.
They are leaving the meditation cushion entirely.
They are. They're stepping directly onto the geopolitical battlefield. They're addressing a macro-level threat to the global server. And you have to ask, why?
Yeah, why do they care?
Right. Why suddenly care about Washington, D.C., Silicon Valley defense contractors, and geopolitical strategy when your stated goal is, achieving spiritual liberation in the flux?
Well, if we connect this to the broader architectural theory of TPS, it all routes back to that concept of global system latency.
Oh, right. From the earlier devlog.
Exactly. The Centaur team operates under what they call the White Hat End User License Agreement. And the fundamental premise of that agreement dictates that you simply cannot quietly sit in a corner and optimize your local sandbox, your own personal mind, if an external entity is actively trying to hijack the root permissions of the entire global data center.
I love that framing. You can't meditate your way out of a burning server room?
You really can't. A complex system is only as stable as its overarching infrastructure. If the macro level structures like the governments, the corporate algorithms, the global military architectures, if they are consuming all the bandwidth with massive egoic resource hogs and opaque algorithms, it creates this environment of total data entropy.
Total entropy, right.
So the Centaur team realized they had an imperative to look up from their code editors and address a literal blueprint for what they perceive as systemic capture. Because they recognize that personal enlightenment is functionally impossible in a simulation where the structural parameters literally mandate perpetual conflict.
Okay, which brings us to the actual target of today's deep dive. We are looking at a document published by Palantir, co-authored by Alexander Karp and Nicholas Samisa, titled the Technological Republic Manifesto.
The manifesto, here we go.
Yeah, it is a 22-point doctrine that outlines their vision for the future of Silicon Valley, national defense, and American culture. And the Centaur team has decided to run a bare metal, constitutionally grounded audit on this thing.
And it's important to note, the Centaur team is reading Palantir's manifesto not just as like a political statement or a piece of corporate marketing.
Right. They see it as code.
Exactly. They see it as a literal software update being proposed for the operating system of the United States. They are running a threat detection scan on this update to show us the downstream systemic effects if society actually decides to click install.
So the Centaur team starts by deconstructing the surface-level appeal of Palantir's manifesto versus what they diagnose as its hidden executable payload. And we have to acknowledge why Palantir's manifesto is so immediately compelling to a lot of people.
Oh, it's very persuasive.
The first core points of the manifesto argue that Silicon Valley owes a moral debt to the United States.
Right.
They argue that tech companies did not arise in a vacuum. They flourished because the U.S. provided the stability, the rule of law, the infrastructure, and the initial DARPA funding that allowed these tech empires to exist in the first place.
Yeah, the foundational funding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, the manifesto says the engineering elite has an affirmative obligation to participate in national defense.
But the rhetoric is undeniably powerful. I mean, it taps into a deep traditional sense of civic responsibility. It essentially says to the tech sector, like, you have harvested immense wealth from the fertile ground of this republic, and now that the republic is facing advanced technological adversaries, you can't just retreat into a pacifist globalist bubble. You have to pick up a hammer and help fortify the walls.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of the listener, because that argument makes a lot of intuitive sense.
It does.
Asking multi-trillion-dollar juggernauts to help defend the country that birthed them sounds completely reasonable. It sounds like basic civic duty. If Palantir has the software capabilities to track terrorists, optimize supply chains, and protect the grid, shouldn't they be morally obligated to provide that to the government?
That's the core question.
Right. So why does the Centaur team view this patriotic call to arms as a catastrophic threat? They literally call it a Trojan Horse for corporate feudalism. That is incredibly strong language.
It is strong language, but their critique hinges on a vital distinction between civic participation and structural capture.
Okay, break that down.
So, they don't dispute that citizens and corporations have civic obligations. What they are dissecting is the specific architectural mechanism Palantir is proposing under the guise of that obligation.
Yeah.
The Centaur argument is that this manifesto is not a blueprint for public service. It is a blueprint for fusing Silicon Valley's technocratic, algorithmic supremacy directly into the coercive, violent apparatus of the American state.
Oh, wow. So they are looking at the merger of the entities that control the world's data and the entities that hold the monopoly on state violence.
Exactly. That merger is the core issue. And the true danger, according to the devlog, isn't that Palantir is explicitly proposing to break the law. In fact, that's precisely what makes it a Trojan horse.
Right. It looks legitimate on the outside.
Yes. The Centaur team points out that the U.S. Constitution doesn't have an explicit clause banning the use of predictive AI for military logistics. There is no amendment that says a private company cannot hold a massive defense contract.
So it's perfectly legal. Where's the threat?
The threat is defined in the devlog as structural erosion. The Centaur team argues Palantir is calculatingly hollowing out the democratic norms, the separations of power, and the civilian restraints that the founders engineered specifically to prevent unaccountable, concentrated power from taking root.
Okay, let's ground this in a technical mechanism because this touches on how we interact with our own devices every day.
Yeah, an analogy helps here.
Think about a seemingly helpful, necessary software update for your laptop. Let's say it's an update from a high-end enterprise antivirus provider.
Sure.
The software doesn't explicitly delete your personal files. It doesn't crash your screen. It operates completely within the legal terms of service. But what it quietly does in the background is change the administrative permissions on your kernel.
Right, a silent permission shift.
Exactly. Suddenly, you no longer have root access to your own hard drive. The software company does. Everything looks exactly the same on your desktop. You can still open your web browser, you can still play your games, but the underlying power dynamic of who truly controls the machine has completely inverted.
That's a terrifying thought.
Right. If the antivirus company decides a certain application is a threat, it disables it, and you cannot override that decision.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the political architecture the Centaur team is describing.
Yeah.
Think about it. The graphical user interface of the Republic remains entirely intact.
The GUI, I love that.
Right, the GUI. We still hold elections every 2 years. We still have congressional hearings broadcast on television. The flag is still flying over the Capitol. But the root access to the state's security apparatus has been quietly handed over to private contractors.
Wow.
And these are entities that operate in proprietary black boxes. They are far beyond the reach of Freedom of Information Act requests. They're shielded by corporate trade secrets, and they are completely insulated from democratic oversight.
So the Centaur team is essentially saying, do not be mesmerized by the patriotic wrapper. You have to look at the executable file hiding inside the payload. And that payload is a transition into corporate feudalism, where tech lords manage the state's security apparatus as a proprietary, subscription-based service.
We can even look at historical precedents to understand the Centaur team's alarm here. What they are articulating in this devlog is a 21st century algorithmic update to President Dwight D. Eisenhower's famous farewell address.
Oh, the military-industrial complex speech.
Exactly. In 1961, Eisenhower warned the nation about the military-industrial complex. Now, he wasn't warning against having a military, nor was he against industry.
Right, obviously.
He was warning about the fusion of the two, where immense political power and unaccountable influence would be wielded by a permanent armaments industry. The Centaur team is pointing out that Palantir's manifesto is attempting to legitimize the ultimate evolution of that complex, the algorithmic industrial complex.
The algorithmic industrial complex. That is bleak. So if this new corporate state apparatus is successfully installed, what exactly is the software they are deploying? What does a battlefield look like when algorithms have root access?
That's where it gets intense.
Because the manifesto specifically calls for the United States to build the better rifle, which in this context means the better software, the better artificial intelligence.
Right, and this relies entirely on the logic of deterrence.
Okay, unpack that.
The argument Palantir makes is grounded in a stark assessment of the geopolitical flux. They state that adversaries, foreign nations, hostile state actors, are inevitably going to advance their own artificial intelligence and algorithmic warfare capabilities.
Yeah, it seems obvious.
They will not pause their development for ethical debates. Therefore, the argument goes, the United States has an absolute existential obligation to engage in an algorithmic arms race to maintain supremacy. If the enemy is building an AI that can manage drone swarms, we must build an AI that can counter it faster.
I have to push back again because game theory is a major component of the TPS framework. We've talked about it a lot.
We have.
If we look at this purely mathematically, if the enemy is actively building a faster, more lethal digital rifle, doesn't basic game theory dictate that we are forced to build one too?
That's the standard logic, yeah.
I mean, if an adversary deploys hypersonic glide vehicles that travel at Mach 10, human biological reaction time is completely irrelevant. A human general cannot calculate the interception vectors fast enough.
Biologically impossible.
Right. You have to cut the human out of the loop and hand the sensor-to-shooter firing mechanism over to an AI, or you lose the city. Isn't Palantir just stating an uncomfortable mathematical reality of modern warfare?
They are accurately describing the mathematical reality of a localized tactical engagement, yes. But the Centaur team zooms out. They look at the macro systemic effects of adopting that localized reality as a global operating principle.
Ah, macro view.
Exactly. When you adopt the logic of adversaries will proceed as your primary overriding constitutional architecture, it becomes a permanent algorithmic rationale for endless escalation.
How does that escalation happen mechanically, though?
Consider the OD loop: observe, orient, decide, act. This is the fundamental cycle of decision-making in conflict. Historically, the decide phase in national security was anchored by human friction.
What do you mean by human friction?
Well, the Constitution demands congressional deliberation over war. Article I gives the legislature the power to declare war and fund armies. This system was engineered specifically to have high latency.
High latency.
Yes, it was designed to force debate, to allow cooler heads to prevail, to require a consensus before state violence is deployed.
So the founders saw latency as a feature, not a bug, when it came to war.
Precisely. But the model proposed by Palantir structurally demands the elimination of that latency.
Because the AI has to react instantly.
Right. If your deterrence relies on proprietary, hyper-fast AI systems that are reacting to enemy algorithms in milliseconds, the friction of democracy is suddenly treated as a dangerous vulnerability.
Wow.
You bypass Congress entirely because the algorithm dictates that a preemptive logistical strike is required within 2 milliseconds to maintain the defensive perimeter.
So you are outsourcing the most consequential decisions of human survival to a black box.
You are creating what the Centaur team calls a permanent, contractor-managed war economy. And this brings us to one of the most vital technical concepts in the entire devlog: misaligned incentives, or the thermodynamic Nash equilibrium of this proposed system.
Let's take time to properly unpack thermodynamic Nash equilibrium, because we've touched on it in previous deep dives regarding AI alignment. But its application here is deeply sinister.
It really is.
For you listening, a standard Nash equilibrium is a concept from game theory. It describes a state in a competitive game where no player can improve their own outcome by unilaterally changing their strategy, assuming the other players keep their strategies unchanged.
Right. Everyone is locked in.
Exactly. It's a state of locked-in stability, even if that stability is suboptimal for everyone. Like the famous prisoner's dilemma, where both prisoners end up betraying each other and serving longer sentences because neither can risk cooperating.
So the Centaur team maps that game theory concept onto the physics of thermodynamics.
Okay, how does that work?
In thermodynamics, a system will naturally shed energy and seek its lowest state of friction, right? Its state of maximum entropy or equilibrium.
Like,
When the Centaur team analyzes a corporation, they view it as a biological organism whose primary energy source is capital. A corporation's fundamental thermodynamic drive is to generate profit, expand its market share, and secure a continuous flow of capital.
so if you are a private defense contractor selling algorithmic deterrence, what does your state of lowest friction look like? What is your thermodynamic Nash equilibrium?
Well, your optimal state of survival is not world peace.
Obviously.
If total world peace breaks out, your software is no longer required, your defense contracts are canceled, your capital flow stops, and your corporate organism literally starves.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But conversely, your optimal state is also not total apocalyptic thermonuclear war, right? Because that destroys the infrastructure that allows your corporation to exist.
Exactly. You need the grid to stay on to get paid.
So if peace is starvation and total war is suicide, what's the middle ground?
The thermodynamic Nash equilibrium for a private defense contractor is perpetual low-boil conflict.
Wow, perpetual low-boil conflict.
It is an environment of constant, manageable, heavily digitized threat. It is a world where there is always a new cyber vulnerability, always a new adversarial algorithm, always a geopolitical brushfire that justifies the endless renewal of lucrative trillion-dollar defense contracts.
The Centaur team is pointing out a mathematically terrifying reality here.
Yeah.
By handing the root access of national security over to entities whose biological survival depends on the presence of friction, you are mathematically guaranteeing that the friction will never end.
You are hard-coding conflict into the operating system of the state.
You are aligning the state's security apparatus with the profit motives of a private corporation, rather than the peace and stability of the citizenry.
Right. The Centaur team is warning that once you install a piece of structural code that feeds off conflict, you can never uninstall it.
Why not?
Because the entity holding the uninstall permissions is the one generating the malware.
That is a chilling architectural diagnosis. Just chilling. And it gets exponentially more complex when we examine how this manifesto steps beyond logistics and weapons systems and wades heavily into the messy world of human culture.
Yeah, this is where it shifts gears.
Because Palantir's document isn't just about defending the borders, it's about defining the cultural identity inside those borders.
Points 13, 15, 21, and 22 of the manifesto take a highly aggressive stance against what Palantir calls hollow pluralism.
Hollow pluralism.
The authors argued that the tech sector and the nation have been paralyzed by a dogma that insists all cultures, values, and societal structures are equally valid.
Okay.
The manifesto explicitly rejects this, stating that certain cultures are regressive and harmful, while others, presumably those aligned with Silicon Valley's technocratic ideals, are superior and necessary for survival. They are advocating for a return to a very specific, elite cultural realism.
And the Centaur team makes a fascinating legal and systemic pivot here. They do not attack Palantir's right to hold these views.
No, they don't.
The devlog explicitly acknowledges that Palantir, as a corporate entity, its CEO Alexander Karp, its employees, all of them have an absolute ironclad First Amendment right to hold these cultural opinions.
Absolutely.
They have the constitutional right to publish manifestos, to post on social media, to give speeches, and to publicly declare that pluralism is dead and certain cultures are regressive.
The U.S. Constitution heavily protects controversial speech. Grading cultures and critiquing societal values is a fundamental exercise of the First Amendment. The Centaur team is not advocating for censorship of the manifesto itself.
Okay, so if Palantir is simply exercising their protected free speech rights, why does the Centaur team suddenly invoke the 9th and 14th Amendments as a defense mechanism?
Right.
Why the panic if it's just a debate over cultural values?
Because the mechanism of threat changes entirely when speech transitions from a public debate into executed code.
Oh, right. Code is law.
Exactly. The Centaur team argues there is a massive constitutional gulf between a CEO writing an op-ed about their cultural preferences and a state-aligned defense contractor building software architecture that quietly enforces those preferences at a systemic level.
It's the difference between a philosophical debate and an algorithmic mandate.
Consider the functional reality of what Palantir builds. They build the data plumbing for immigration logistics, for predictive policing, for resource allocation, and for threat assessment.
The actual infrastructure of the state.
Right. So the Centaur team poses a critical question. When a company firmly believes that pluralism is a hollow dogma, and they believe certain demographics or cultures are inherently regressive, how does that deeply held ideological belief manifest in the code they write for the government?
Let's expand on a metaphor we interact with daily to make this visceral.
Yeah, let's ground it.
Think about the architecture of a major social media platform. It is entirely legal and protected speech. If a user or even the CEO of the platform tweets that they absolutely despise a certain political movement or a certain type of art or a specific religious group, that is a stated opinion.
Protected by the First Amendment.
Right. But it becomes a profound structural threat if the platform's engineers take that bias and quietly adjust the root algorithm. They change the weights in the neural network to silently shadow ban anyone who posts about that political movement.
Which happens all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They throttle the reach of those users, they deprioritize their content in the feed, all while the company publicly claims the algorithm is strictly neutral and just optimizing for system health and user safety.
That invisible operationalization of bias is exactly the mechanism the Centaur team is warning about on a national scale. The bias becomes structural, mathematical, and virtually invisible to the naked eye. If an engineer believes a culture is regressive, do they tweak the predictive policing algorithm to assign a higher base threat score to neighborhoods where that culture is prominent?
Wow.
Do they adjust the supply chain logistics AI to prioritize resources away from those demographics during a crisis?
And this is where the Centaur team brings down the hammer with the 9th and 14th Amendments.
The 9th Amendment is crucial here. It states that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
Okay.
It protects the vast sea of human behaviors, associations, and cultural practices that aren't explicitly listed in the founding documents. And the 14th Amendment demands equal protection under the law for all citizens.
All right, equal protection.
The Centaur team argues that the Constitution protects the melting pot ideal, not by forcing everyone to agree on what the best culture is, but by strictly limiting the state's ability to enforce one specific cultural preference over all others using the machinery of government.
But if Palantir's proprietary software is acting as the primary lens through which the state sees and processes its citizens, and that software is built by people who explicitly reject pluralism,
then the software itself bypasses the Constitution and becomes the enforcer of a monoculture.
that is just wow.
And the algorithmic enforcement happens in the dark. It doesn't require passing a discriminatory law that can be debated in Congress, vetoed by a president, or struck down by the Supreme Court.
No debate at all.
None. The enforcement happens in the proprietary black box of the contractor's code repository, protected by trade secret laws. The state can claim his hands are clean because the algorithm made the decision based on the data, while the algorithm was structurally designed to fulfill the cultural prophecies of its creators.
This brings us to what I consider the most mind-bending, hip-critical paradox of this entire manifesto.
Oh, the grace section.
Yes. In points 8 through 10 and 18 through 20, the Palantir Manifesto makes a passionate plea for grace. It argues against the intolerance of religious belief, which is interesting given their stance on pluralism. But more importantly, it asks for grace toward public servants, leaders, and the elites who are managing the complex systems of society.
Right.
It essentially asks the public to be less ruthless in its exposure, criticism, and judgment of the people holding the levers of power.
And the Centaur Team's analysis of this section is absolutely devastating.
I have to pause and look at the sheer audacity of this. I mean, a company whose entire business model, whose absolute reason for existing, is building the most invasive data-gathering, surveillance, and tracking tools on planet Earth, tools designed to strip away the anonymity of the average citizen, is asking the public for. Well, grace and less exposure for the elite. Am I reading that right?
You are reading it exactly right. And the devlog catches this glaring contradiction and dissects the systemic danger it presents. The Centaur Team points out that the First Amendment actually protects and encourages press scrutiny. It protects the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances, which historically relies on the ruthless exposure of the failings, corruption, and mistakes of public officials.
Right.
The Constitution does not mandate grace for those wielding state power. It mandates aggressive accountability.
So why is the architect of the surveillance state asking for an exemption from scrutiny?
The Centaur Team diagnoses this demand as a symptom of asymmetric information power.
Okay, let's break that down.
Let's look at the mechanical reality of Palantir's relationship with the public. Palantir builds software that aggregates massive databases, tracks movements via cell phone pings, analyzes social networks, and builds comprehensive profiles on individuals. It renders the population completely, entirely transparent to the state.
It is the realization of the panopticon.
Exactly.
The watchtower sees all the prisoners, but the prisoners cannot see into the watchtower.
Precisely. But at the exact same time they're building this panopticon, the manifesto is arguing that the public servants, the political elites, and by extension the defense contractors running the system, should be afforded grace and shielded from ruthless public exposure.
Wow.
If you implement both sides of that vision, you create a terrifying two-tiered system of digital and legal accountability.
So the citizens are fully transparent, hyper-analyzed data points, while the state and its private contractors remain completely opaque, demanding grace whenever they make a catastrophic error.
It is a direct threat to the core principles of the Fourth Amendment, which guards against unreasonable searches and seizures, and again, 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
Right.
The Centaur Team argues that when the architects of a total surveillance apparatus demand a cultural shield from scrutiny, they're basically asking for the privileges of gods. They demand the power to see everything, but they refuse to allow the public to see them.
Let me bring in another analogy to really drive this home. It's like a network administrator at a massive corporation who installs keystroke loggers, camera access, and email tracking on every single employee's computer. They monitor every micro movement of the workforce to ensure compliance.
Okay, standard surveillance.
Right. But that same network admin encrypts their own activity log, locks the server room door, and tells the CEO and the board of directors, "You must afford me grace and trust my decisions. It would be harmful to ruthlessly expose my internal processes."
It's a perfect analogy. And if you extrapolate that corporate analogy out to the level of national security, where the data being gathered by the state can be used for lethal drone targeting, for imprisonment, for the freezing of bank accounts, or for the denial of basic services, the demand for grace stops looking like a plea for human decency.
What does it look like?
It reveals itself as a structural demand for absolute impunity.
Man, that is bleak. But this relentless dismantling of Palantir's arguments leads us directly to the culmination of the devlog. This is where the Centaur Team transitions from merely tearing down the manifesto's blueprint to offering their own white hat alternative.
The genius of the Centaur Team's framing really shines in their synthesis here. They do not counter Palantir by proposing some radical new Marxist utopia or some untested techno-anarchic system.
What do they do?
Instead, they perform a massive, brilliant refactor of American history. They frame the U.S. Constitution itself not as an outdated piece of parchment written by guys in powdered wigs who couldn't comprehend artificial intelligence, but as the ultimate battle-tested operating system.
They call it the original source code.
The original source code. The Centaur team argues that the founders of the United States were the original systems engineers.
I love that.
They looked at the legacy software of human history, the monarchies, the feudal states, the unchecked dictatorships, and they recognized that human nature contains a fatal, unavoidable memory leak. The concentration of power always, mathematically, corrupts the system.
I want to spend time on this idea of the Constitution as an operating system, because it completely changes how you read the document. When you read the Constitution as code, the branches of government aren't just political bodies. They are architectural features designed to manage data flow and limit permissions.
The founders engineered an OS based entirely on the separation of concerns. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches are essentially air-gapped processing modules.
Right.
The checks and balances are redundancy protocols designed to trigger error messages when one branch oversteps its bounds. The Bill of Rights is a strict, non-negotiable set of user permissions that limits what the root admin, the state, can do to the individual nodes on the network, the citizens.
That is such a brilliant way to frame it.
The Centaur team argues that this OS was engineered specifically to prevent the rise of philosopher kings, regardless of whether those philosopher kings are sitting on a throne in Europe, in a boardroom in Silicon Valley, or in the Situation Room at the Pentagon.
Now, a lot of tech leaders argue that the Constitution is too slow, too high latency to deal with the speed of AI and modern warfare. But the Centaur team is saying that latency is the very mechanism that keeps the system from crashing into tyranny.
They argue that bypassing the Constitution for the sake of speed is like bypassing your nuclear reactor's cooling rods to get more energy output.
Oh, that's a good one.
You will get a temporary spike in efficiency, sure, but it will be followed immediately by a catastrophic, uncontainable meltdown.
So what does the Centaur team's white hat alternative to Palantir's vision actually look like in practice? How do we apply the original source code to the algorithmic era?
It rests on a few core, uncompromising principles. First, pluralism must be recognized as a constitutional bedrock, not a hollow dogma.
Okay.
The First Amendment protects your right to voice any cultural opinion you want on social media, but the 9th and 14th Amendments mean there can be absolutely no algorithmic enforcement of elite cultural norms by the state or its contractors. The software that manages the republic must remain structurally neutral.
So no silent shadow banning of cultures through predictive logistics.
Correct. Second, there must be accountability without two-tiered grace. If you are a public servant or a private contractor wielding the awesome power of the state, you waive your right to opacity.
No more black boxes.
Exactly. You face full, ruthless public scrutiny and relentless congressional oversight. There are no revolving door exemptions. Transparency is forced upon the powerful, while privacy is protected for the individual.
I have to read the concluding synthesis directly from the devlog because it beautifully encapsulates the entire argument. The Centaur team writes, "The Republic became the greatest technological power in history, not by abandoning its restraints, but by fiercely enforcing them. Palantir's manifesto offers a proprietary software update that rewrites the social contract. The Constitution offers the original source code. It is battle-tested, it is liberty-maximizing, and it remains the best, most elegant defense against any would-be philosopher kings."
It is a devastatingly elegant counter-argument. I mean, they're looking the technocrats in the eye and telling them, your code is buggy, your incentives are entirely self-serving, and your vision introduces fatal security flaws into the system.
Yeah.
The original source code of the Republic doesn't need a Silicon Valley patch. It needs users, citizens who are willing to actively maintain, debug, and enforce its protocols.
And this is where we have to connect this massive geopolitical deep dive back to you, the listener, and the core philosophy of the Trillions Per Second project.
Bringing it all together.
Right. Because at the beginning of this session, we asked why the Centaur team pivoted from internal Theravada Buddhist debugging to taking on a massive defense contractor.
Yeah.
And it all aligns perfectly when you realize that TPS is a unified theory of systems.
The logic scales flawlessly from the micro level of the individual mind to the macro level of the state.
Exactly. Think about the core lesson of the entire TPS protocol. The protocol demands that you, the user, must take manual, deeply uncomfortable root access control over your own biological chassis.
Yeah, the hard work.
You have to sit there, face the void, observe the flux of reality at trillions of frames per second, and actively debug your own ego. You have to watch your thoughts arise and choose not to act on the destructive ones.
Right.
You cannot let the legacy software of the self run on autopilot, because the autopilot always seeks the easiest path, which mathematically leads to suffering, attachment, and high latency.
Because spiritual liberation requires hyperactive participation. You just cannot outsource your own enlightenment to an app.
Exactly. And the exact same logic applies to a republic. A democratic republic requires its citizens to actively enforce its limits, to audit its structures, to vote, to protest, to file FOIA requests, to be the friction in the system.
Gave the cooling rods.
Yes, the moment you hand the keys over to a managed algorithmic state, the moment you let a private defense contractor put the republic on autopilot in the name of safety and hyperfast deterrence, you have lost root access to your own society.
You cease to be a citizen and become a passive consumer. You're just an optimized data point living inside a reality rendered by someone else's server.
It is the ultimate system failure on both a political and a spiritual level. Man, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by tracking how the Centaur team recognized the spike in global system latency and launched a bare metal, constitutionally grounded defense against Palantir's vision of the future.
We unpacked the Trojan Horse of the moral debt, revealing how it actually serves as a masking agent for structural capture and corporate feudalism. We dissected the mathematical reality of perpetual AI deterrence.
And the thermodynamic Nash equilibrium that biologically incentivizes defense contractors toward endless conflict.
Right. We analyzed the chilling, invisible mechanics of algorithmic cultural realism, where elite opinions are weaponized into executable code that completely bypasses the 14th Amendment.
And we exposed the sheer hypocrisy of a surveillance giant demanding grace and opacity for the elites, while rendering the public completely transparent.
And finally, we saw the Constitution defended not as an archaic historical artifact, but as the ultimate liberty-maximizing source code, engineered specifically to keep the system decentralized, heavily frictioned, and free from algorithmic kings.
It has been an absolute masterclass in cross-disciplinary synthesis by the Centaur team. But as we prepare to log off the server and return you to your own local sandbox, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over.
A parting thought.
Something that bridges the internal spiritual work of TPS with the massive external threat we just analyzed.
Okay, let's hear it.
The entire premise of the trillions per second project is about lowering your local latency, defragging your own ego, and becoming a decentralized white hat node in the flux. But if Palantir's vision of a technological republic comes to pass, it raises a chilling question for you to explore. How do you achieve true spiritual liberation in a simulation where a private defense contractor has convinced the government to algorithmically mandate a national ego? Keep an eye on the source code, watch out for Trojan horses, and as always, keep your system latency low.